Today we're going to talk about acidity in white wine. So if you have ever called high acid in a blind tasting on a white wine just because it had citrusy or tart flavors, you may have been measuring the wrong thing. This video is for anybody who wants a clear and repeatable way to measure acidity without guesswork. We'll cover what acidity is, why it lives in the structure category and not the flavor category. We'll sort out the difference between acidic, sour, and tart. We'll walk through a simple calibration method and point out some things that can trick your palate. And by the end, you'll have a practical cue you can use to taste, especially white wines. So what is acid? Acid is one of the main components of structure in wines, and it is especially important in white wines. So structural components also include body, acid, tannin, and you can use a meter of sorts to measure them by measuring low, medium, or high. You can gauge these. Structural components are physical sensations. They are not flavors. So acid is a structural sensation. It is a feeling. In white wines, acidity is the backbone. It brings freshness. It brings ageability. It's really what makes a white wine taste lively. Not enough acid, a white wine will feel kind of flat on the palate. The terms sour and tart can sometimes overlap with acidity, but they are not the same thing. Sour is a basic taste signal. It's one of your tastes. Tart is a flavor impression based on that taste, where sometimes you'll get citrusy notes, you'll get tart green apple notes, more underripe fruit. And so sometimes sour and tart can trick you into thinking a wine has high acid. But lower acid wines can be sour and tart, and higher acid wines may not be sour or tart at all. So we want to think about the structural acidity or the physical response to acid. Ask yourself, am I measuring a flavor or am I measuring a physical response? Okay, so how do you measure this physical response? How do you actually measure acidity? The most reliable clue for acid is how much you salivate, or how much you drool, and how much you keep salivating even after you swallow. You want to focus under the tongue and along the sides of your tongue and your gums. High acid wines will keep your mouth salivating even after you swallow. You want to put more wine in there. All right, so how do I calibrate? High acid wines, after you take a sip of them, are going to make your mouth water almost immediately after you taste or swallow the wine. So a lot of times I like to take a sip of the wine, swallow it, lean over, and then if drool comes out immediately, if I have to stop myself, put my head up to keep from drooling, that wine has high acid. Medium acid wines usually have a little delay to them, usually about 3 seconds to 5 seconds or so. So take a sip of wine and you lean over and it takes 3 seconds before that saliva starts to form and starts to fall out of your mouth. That would be a medium acid wine. Low acid wines usually take 5 seconds or longer before you start drooling. You may not even drool at all. These wines usually have more of a flat finish to them, sometimes a little bit heavier. Benchmark wines to reference. So German Riesling, or any Riesling for that matter, typically always has high acid. It retains its acidity, usually no matter where it's grown. Chenin Blanc is another one. Sauvignon Blanc, especially from Marlborough, is great as well. Medium acid wines. Wines like Chardonnay, typically grown in California, or Burgundy. Low acid wines, Gewürztraminer, and Viognier. So typically your thicker skin, more aromatic varieties are often lower acid. Climate is also really important to note when you're tasting for acidity. Grapes grown in cooler climates tend to retain their acidity, so it's generally higher, where grapes grown in warmer climates often lose their acidity faster. All right, and real quick, some things that can trick your palate. The first thing is temperature. So if a wine is too cold, a lot of times that makes the flavors and the structure feel a lot tighter, which can trick your brain into thinking the wine has more elevated acidity. It's good to kind of retaste those wines as they warm up. Residual sugar or leftover sugar in a bottle of wine after fermentation a lot of times will soften the perceived acidity. So Riesling is a really good example of that. That's why this one can be kind of tricky. Dry styles are better to gauge acid just because you know what you're getting. The residual sugar left over in some of these bottles can trick your palate into thinking the acid is lower than it actually is. This is why focusing on how much you're drooling actually is the most important clue. Again, there's that aroma bias. Citrus cues can trick your brain into thinking wine has higher acidity than it actually does. Don't assume until you've measured everything. So, the most effective way to practice this is to grab a high acid wine like a Riesling, a medium acid wine like a Chardonnay from California, and a low acid wine like a Gewürztraminer from Alsace. Taste them side by side and see what your palate does. See how much you're drooling with each of these examples. Comparison is really what builds your sensory memory. So just tasting one of these wines on their own is not going to give you a gauge or a meter as much as tasting them side by side will. Once you focus on salivation and benchmark that across a number of different wines, that calibration and that call actually starts to make sense. I am Kendi. I am a sommelier and huge tasting nerd and educator. And if you are early into learning wine and want a more complete tasting framework with this and plenty of other steps, my free Intro to Tasting Wine course is the next best step for you. It walks through all the structural components in a practical way so that you can start applying them the next time you open a bottle. You can find the link in the description. Until next time.